In the beginning, there was nothing, save for the great heart at the center of everything. Infinite in imagination, in wisdom, in love. It sat at the center of it all, just being. And yet because it was all it is, it had a sense of incompletion. Infinite in love, and yet thinking it did not know quite what love was. Belonging wholly to itself, and yet having a sense that it did not know quite what it meant to belong. It sat at the center of all things, frustrated in the sense of incompletion, until one day, at last, it had an idea. I shall make other hearts in my image, it said. I shall spawn them off of my own being. I shall stay connected to those hearts so that they will know my love, and I will at last know what it means to be loved, that I will know these hearts and they will know me. And so, in an act of bravery, it began to unfurl itself, to unravel the strings, the great heart strings, and cast them off in all directions from this place in the center of the universe, forming new hearts at the end of each one, all bound together in a great web. And pleased with its work, the heart sat back and waited to know and to be known, to love, to be loved, to finally understand what it meant to belong. I will hope you will indulge me this morning in the hubris of creating a brand new creation story to tell you all today. But I'm challenged every time love comes up as a theme, especially in February. I know I did not make up this calendar, but it's a difficult subject to speak of, although we speak of it every week. Love is the doctrine of this church. We say those words week after week, probably sometimes without really reflecting on what it is that they mean. Now, I could talk about the physiology of love, I suppose. I could talk about what goes on in our brains and the chemistry of our bodies when we are feeling love, and yet somehow that seems to be incomplete in its message, unsatisfying. It doesn't begin to describe what it is we are feeling when we encounter this thing called love. I could talk about all the different words the Greeks had for love, all the various kinds of love that human beings feel towards one another, and that would just end up being a list that doesn't really explain what it is that we're getting at here. And so instead, in a fit of pique and frustration, I started telling myself a new story, although it is not that new. It's centered around this age-old concept. God is love. Another one of those platitudes we toss around, probably without really thinking too deeply upon its meaning. We don't understand God, we don't understand love, so we equate the two things together and hope somehow we have an equation that tells us something about what it is we're trying to talk about. Or as Bishop Desmond Tutu says, at the center of this existence is a heart beating with love. So let's take God out of the equation completely. Let's just talk about love at the center of the universe. Still, I'm left with something very abstract to talk about. What is this love thing? We talk about it in culture on a very surface level. Most songs about love are kind of shallow. But instead, we use poetry and metaphor and painting and images to try to get to some sense of meaning of what it is that we're talking about. And still we don't get down to a solid definition. It's like what Justice Potter Stewart had to say back in the 60s about obscenity when the Supreme Court was hearing cases on that. I know it when I see it, but I couldn't for the life of me tell you what it is. We know it when we see it. We know it when we feel it, if we feel it. Sometimes it just takes one connection, one first little burst of a sense of belonging to someone or something. Maybe dog is love instead. Rumi certainly thinks so, and the God of Cynthia Ryland's poem seems to catch on to that a little bit. There is something to be said about having a relationship with a dog. When we first adopted ours, I was told to be prepared to enter into a world of unconditional love, and that is certainly the truth. Although, again, I couldn't define for you exactly what that love was. There was just a sense of belonging. As if our dog was saying to us, and with apologies to the authors of the Hebrew Scriptures, I will be your dog and you will be my people. And we are connected to one another. And I think that is the beginning of what is at the heart of this love we are talking about, this sense of belonging. I will be yours and you will be mine. I am aware of this connection between us that has always been there in some way or another, and now in awareness there's this energy working back and forth across this line that powers me up with this sense of belonging and causes me to act out in crazy ways, to want to belong somehow even more to more people, to more things. To see more of those connections, to send that energy up and down those lines of connection, no matter where we first become aware of that connection, whether it's with our dog, or our newborn child, or our spouses, our family, friends, wherever we first sense that energy, kind of like a drug, makes us want more, to seek it out more and more, to take action in its name, to want to protect all the little pieces of that great heart at the center of everything as we come to discover them. And that's why we deal with love at a religious level. That is why it is of such import to what we do as a community of faith. Because if religion in its etymological root is the understanding of the things that bind us together, then to seek to be aware of and find energy from the ways we are connected is the heart of all we do together. And that, to my mind, is the root of love. And so we say, week in, week out, love is the doctrine of this church. This is not a new idea to us. This has been the heart of what would become Unitarianism and Unitarian Universalism over the centuries. When our Puritan ancestors first came to these shores and they built their first congregational churches, they covenanted together and pledged to walk in the ways of love together, both known and yet to be made known. Love was their doctrine, and what that meant is this is what we were trying to teach to one another. Lest you get a little twitchy when you hear the word doctrine in relationship to this church. It is just the thing we are trying to teach in our words, in our deeds, in our ways of being, the ways we know, the ways that are yet to be made known. This is ultimately why we are here. To shine a light on all those connections that are there, unbreakable, whether we like them or not. whether we see them or not, whether we want them or not. The threads of the great heart at the center of all things that bind us all together. Now, I don't want you to think that this is an easy task, this love. It is not a Hallmark card love. It is not a little Valentine in your fourth grade shoebox love. It is not a hearts and flowers and chocolate love, although that might be a piece of it. But what we're getting at is a love that is hard work, not touchy-feely. And that is simply because we human beings, we are phenomenally skilled experts at not seeing the connections, at being willfully oblivious to them at times. The great heart at the center of all things sat in the center and waited to know and be known, to love and be loved, to understand at last that sense of belonging. It sat and it waited, and at first things were going great. But as more and more pieces of heart spun off on those heartstrings, as she unraveled more and more out into the universe, the more it became clear that the little hearts were not quite as infinite as the great heart was. As infinite and imaginative and wise as the great heart was, as limited the little hearts were. And that sense of belonging, that sense of connection, fomented by all of those interconnected heartstrings, became too much to contemplate, to the point where the little hearts thought they could not bear to know this much, to love this much, to belong quite this much. And so they started to try to manage their connections. They began to invent categories of being. The hearts on this side of the great heart see a different picture of the great heart than the hearts on that side of the great heart. And which one is the right picture? We can fight about that forever. And we over here who see this picture are ultimately right. And the hearts over there have developed different words for what is at the center of all things, and they don't belong to us, and so we shall separate ourselves over here. And bit by bit, year by year, the hearts began to find ways to declare their separateness from one another. And over time, they even convinced themselves that that separation was not their fault. It was the fault and the flaw of those on the other side of the network. And because it was their fault, we must ultimately cast them into hell because we belong and not them. And the great heart looked on in dismay. For the concept of hell was never in its imagination, in all of its infinite imagination and wisdom. And it shook its head to realize they did not understand that this hell was something of their own devising. We are artists of separation. It is an unfortunate skill of our unique human genius to devise all the reasons why we are unlike others, why we are more worthy than others, why we are more loving than others, why we are more faithful than others, why we love better than others. This is a turning away from the reality of those connections. This is a willingness not to see. And sometimes we are taught how to do this from an early age where we don't even need to think too hard about it. We just learn from birth who's in and who's out, who belongs and who does not. And the minute we deny that sense of belonging is the minute we perpetuate that illusion of our separateness from one another, and we cut ourselves off from the possibility of love, and we cast ourselves into a sort of hell. Our universalist theology tells us there is ultimately no hell. No place we could be damned to for all eternity because of who we are, or more likely, who we are not. If there is a hell, posited the universalists, it is only the ones of our own making, the ones that are created because of our sense of separation, the illusions we perpetuate for ourselves. The means by which we cut ourselves off from one another, or at least try to, in spite of our unbreakable connections. But the good news is that the only hells that exist are the ones of our own making. Because we are finite, ephemeral, limited beings, so too then are all of those hells. None of them last forever. We can cast ourselves out of them as easily as we can be cast into them. We just need to be willing to risk awakening to the connections once again. We need to lean into our longing. I have loved that Rumi poem for 20 years, for that one line alone. That longing you feel is the answer. To want to see the connection again, to want to feel that connection to another, that is the beginning of reawakening to this love we are talking about, this deep love. The sense of connection to all things. That longing is not a lament of emptiness, but an awakening to what has always been there. The message at the heart of Unitarian Universalism that I have been preaching to you since I got here begins with one simple concept. All are loved. You are loved, I am loved, we are all loved. And those skeptics among you have asked me in the past, and rightly so, loved by who? Loved by what? And I would love to turn around and just say to you, well, by God, obviously, but I know that's not a satisfying answer for those of you who are asking me that question. What is the source of this all-consuming love that comes from outside of us? And the answer is simply this: to the extent that we know ourselves to be loved by some source outside ourselves, whether we conceive of God or mystery or infinite love or any of this or none of this, it is because we are called to be the hands of that love. Love is the doctrine. If that is what we profess, then we are teaching it to one another by the way we demonstrate it to one another. We are loved because we have to love one another. That's it. We are love. We are loved because we are love. And because it is a doctrine, we have a practical pedagogy. We have hands-on lessons to show to one another, to demonstrate the ways of that love. The rest of that UU gospel I preach follows as this: we are loved and we are bound together by all those connections that I am talking about. And because we are loved and because we are bound together, we cannot give up on one another. We, the hands of love, are called to be reaching out continually with that love. Whether the person on the other end of that hand can see the connection or not, whether it is too dark to see, whether they want it or not, whether they like it or not. In the midst of all these little hells that we build for ourselves, we are, as my friend and colleague, the Reverend Joanna Crawford says, called to love the hell out of this world. This is the t-shirt I wear to county council meetings. Joanna writes, to love the hell out of the world means to see with our hearts, fragile and unprotected. To accept that life is shattering and excruciating. To see the hell in a world, in a group, in a person, in a tier. To know that it is the experience of both the oppressor and the oppressed, as we are both. To wade into it, armored for battle, but leaving our heart completely exposed, because that is what we follow. It is our night goggles in the dark world of smoke, failing beams, and faint cries from over there. We love emphatically, actively, with our hearts and feet, our hands, pushing the wreckage aside, reaching down, stretching until we fear our arms can go no further, but they do. We touch fingers with others, then grab on for dear life, pulling them out to safety, then going back in to remove the hell itself before it traps someone else. We round a corner only to find hands waiting for us, to pull us to safety, to warmth. For we are both Savior and the saved. The hell is all around, and we work in great passionate swoops and in slow, plodding routines to put that extravagant love into action and remove all the bits of it from the world. Misery, ill health, disease, viciousness of greed in the face of want, voices that shout hate or whisper meanness, soul-eating addiction, humiliation, despair, injustice that curls up nastily, poisoning the spirit of giver and receiver. We do not flee. Bone-chillingly afraid we may be, but we step forward. We are the only form of love we'll take, and the work is ours to do. Our job, our mission, is to take all of that love, all that overflowing, passionate, undying agape, and train it on the hell that exists in this world. We are Unitarian Universalists, from one source to one destiny, here to love the hell out of this world. That's it. That is the heart at the center of everything, what we are called to do. Everything else we circle around in our religious life, hospitality, beauty, justice, gratitude, all of it comes out of a sense of this boundless love that we are called to dig into this world with. To relight all those long, darkened pathways with the connections we have forgotten about, to re-energize those bonds that are always between us, to expose once and for all the illusion that is we are separate from one another, pointing the way back to the great heart at the center of all things. To remember finally that we belong to each other. The great heart sits at the center of the universe, but it does not despair, because every once in a while, a flash of hope lights up along those connections. Somebody sees the big picture, sees all of those heartstrings spreading out from the center that bind us all together, and whispers to the hearts next to it, "This is the way we are going. These are the paths we must see. And so the illusion of hell, someday, it knows, will be vanquished. And someday the heart knows we will remember that we belong to each other. And someday it too will feel the depth of the bonds that unite us all. It will know the truth of its own boundless love. This is our doctrine. May it be so.